Lyndon Johnson, of course, started out in politics as a congressman from Texas. He had been an admirer of Franklin D. Roosevelt and his New Deal. But when Johnson got elected, first as congressman in Texas and then as senator in Texas from 1948 until he ran for vice president, Johnson was probably seen as a moderate segregationist.
And there's Lyndon on the Tennessee Walker. Quite a handsome Western gentleman.
He came from Texas, which was a Jim Crow state. Johnson did support efforts to prevent any civil rights bills from passing, particularly those in the late 1940s when President Harry Truman initiated several bills.
When he was in Congress, he was out there saying all the things in the back rooms with all the cigar smoke over the poker. He was calling us all the names.
I call him a moderate segregationist because he was not one of those rabid segregationists, people like Theodore, Bilbo.
Listen, Mr. Bilbo, well, listen to me. I'll give you a lesson in history. Listen while I tell you that the foreigners you hate are the very same people made America great.
Theodore Bilbo was the senator from Mississippi, and he had been governor of Mississippi before that. He was probably one of the most rabid white supremacists that's ever sat in the U.S. Senate from the South. He wrote a book which said that Black Americans were certainly inferior. I'm not sure he said the Great Replacement Theory. That's what the descendants of Bilbo, the white supremacists of today, call it. He said he feared most of all miscegenation, which of course would be whites and blacks cohabitating and producing children who he would disdainfully call mulattoes.
And the core idea, essentially, is that non-white people are going to take over the US and take away white power. Basically, that there is a threat to white power of institutions in America.
In 1945, the United States Congress passed a law that said that for veterans returning from the war, they didn't have to pay a poll tax in order to vote. And one of those soldiers coming home from the war was a young African American named Medgar Evers. He said, if you don't know how to keep, and I'm not going to say the word he used, but if you don't know how to keep a black person from voting, and then he winked, yet he said, you see them the night before. So that's what really inflamed African Americans and civil rights organizations. They petitioned Congress to send an investigating committee down to Mississippi. African Americans, both from the NAACP and people like Medgar Evers, coming to testify. Before the Senate could reach the conclusion on whether to finally unseat Bilbo, which would have been fairly unprecedented, Bilbo solved the problem for them. He died. He had cancer of the mouth.
You don't like Negroes, you don't like Jews. If there's anyone you do like, it sure is news. You don't like Poles, Italians, Catholics too. Is it any wonder, Bilbo, that we don't like you?
African Americans were an important voting bloc at that time. As Johnson rose in power, he was more sensitive to the fact that if he was going to win a national election rather than a state election from a segregationist state, he would have to appeal to a broader constituency than just the South.
And what a vote it was, the Democratic landslide of all time.
What's clear is that Johnson is developing more of a sensitivity to the needs of African Americans, even if it's only a political sensitivity at that point.
By the time you got to the 1960s and you had this Southern Democrat, an LBJ, pushing for this legislation that was going to enhance the lives of African Americans and ideally bring about a sense of equality that was 100 years lacking, you start seeing a change.
In the greatest story of a momentous year, John F. Kennedy defeated GOP standard-bearer Richard Nixon in one of the closest presidential elections on record. The youngest man ever elected president takes the burden from the oldest ever to hold the office as America enters the critical and challenging 60s.
When John F. Kennedy selected him as his vice presidential choice in 1960,
I think that Senator Johnson will be the most effective vice president in the history of our country.
Kennedy really selected him primarily because Johnson could appeal to the South. The black vote in the North was extremely important in deciding the outcome of that election. Johnson, as a senator from Texas, could appeal to the South in a way that Kennedy from Massachusetts could not. Kennedy had him do assignments. One was about equal employment opportunity, and that gave Johnson a bigger vision of civil rights, and he became more in contact with civil rights leaders.
As the Freedom Marchers remained at the monument grounds to close their demonstration in prayer, their leaders moved on to the White House to meet with President Kennedy.
So when Kennedy was killed in 1963, the leaders of these major organizations were willing to give Johnson a good look. They thought that Johnson was no longer, the segregationist, the senator from Texas, that he would work with African Americans, and they were correct. He would.
I knew Ava DuVernay before she filmed Selma. And so when she started filming it, some folks who lived in Selma reached out to me and they were like, you need to be in touch with that lady to make sure that she's doing right by us, because people have a lot of feelings about the betrayal of the history. So we connected because I was like, I have a lot to talk about in this. My role in the 2014 film Selma was because of my work in the city of Selma for a large part of my life. After college, I went to work for 21st Century and do youth leadership work, because it's almost impossible to live in Selma and not be completely engulfed by the history. We hear these stories and we kind of take them for granted, but really understanding that your aunties, your uncles, your grandparents, your great cousins, whatever, they literally stood in the face of mortal danger. These people were out to kill them, literally, just because they wanted to take part in the democratic process that's supposed to be for everybody in this country. I was there when they were filming the Bloody Sunday scene. And I will tell you, it even makes me emotional now.
Yeah, I was unconscious. If you have to demonstrate in every walk of life, do it. Don't stand on the shoulders of people who fought and died.
So many people who are on that bridge are very important people in my life, mentors and family like folks to me. These people are still around. Joanne Bland is, probably the closest to me, and Linda Lowry, her sister. Miss Linda was the youngest person on that bridge on Bloody Sunday. Everyday people who became leaders, legends, names who we think of now as giants, who were just regular folks who knew that they had to make bold moves in order to impact our lives today. I grew up being mentored by Reverend C.T. Vivian.
Reverend C.T. Vivian stood in Alabama in front of the State House and was knocked down on the ground, and he got back up and he said, "What kind of people are you?" So it took the challenging, the moral challenge of the right to exist in a country like white people. And so black people died, white people died and sacrificed their lives. They lived on the front line.
Today, the Negro story and the American story fuse and blend. The stories of our nation and of the American Negro are like two great rivers. And the two rivers, one shining with promise, the other dark-stained with oppression, began to move towards one another. Yet for almost a century, the promise of that day was not fulfilled. Today is a towering and certain mark that in this generation, that promise will be kept. In our time, the two currents will finally mingle and rush as one great stream. Its only purpose is to right that wrong.
All of these progressive moments are happening under your administration. There are going to be a whole lot of people who say you are a traitor to the race. You are a traitor to the agenda.
It is true he had made enemies in the South, in the white South anyway. The white South was a strong supporter of the Vietnam War. The war was becoming increasingly unpopular. It was dividing Democrats, many of whom were beginning to speak out against the war. It was dividing young people from old people, working class whites from professional whites. And I think Johnson was concerned that he would lose the election. And Johnson didn't want to lose elections. He decided, he thought, not to tear the country apart any further, and he would not run.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Systemic racism did not change after the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So when Dr. King was killed in April of 1968, there was a frustration. There was an anger.
Yet they were led to believe by all the rhetoric of the civil rights movement that their lives would improve. And if anything, their lives were getting worse.